In this video, we're going to talk about what happens to guns in bankruptcy. Welcome, debtors and borrowers, to Bankruptcy Bailout. My name is Matt Burkus, Colorado bankruptcy and debt relief attorney, and today we're going to answer the question, what happens to guns in bankruptcy? Or I'm sure what's more important to you, will you lose your guns in bankruptcy and how to prevent that? So let's get into it. So the first issue is the elephant in the room, and that's the Second Amendment. So let me just set the record straight. That dog won't hunt. There is no Second Amendment constitutional issue when it comes to bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is a voluntary proceeding to deal with your debt, and your guns are assets just like anything else. So the Second Amendment is not going to protect you. All right, so with guns in bankruptcy, they are an asset. So we have to treat them like any other asset. So the first question we ask is, well, who owns the guns? Ownership. Now, usually that's an easy question. It's the person who's filing bankruptcy, but you still have to ask. Because sometimes I ask the question and the answer is going to be, well, yeah, it's my dad's gun, but I have it at my house, right? So the first thing to do is clarify who owns the gun. So the next question then becomes, well, how much is it worth? And this is challenging for guns in bankruptcy because firearms tend to retain value, right? So you have to narrow it down, and generally speaking, there's plenty of websites out there where you can get a general idea of what your firearms are worth, but that's the next thing. We have to clarify what they're worth. Then the third question is, well, are there any liens against the guns? That's uncommon unless you've pawned them, right? But if you pawn them, they'd be at the pawn shop, all right? And then lastly, and this is the important one for firearms, is are there any exemptions that protect the firearms when you file Chapter 7 bankruptcy? Unfortunately, most states do not have an exemption. Now, exemptions are laws that allow you to keep your assets even though you're filing bankruptcy. So there's exemptions for your home, for your car, household goods, but only 14 states have a specific exemption for firearms. And typically those exemptions are what we call quantitative exemptions, where they say you can keep one firearm up to a certain value. Or I think Texas, it's 2 firearms and the value doesn't matter, right? So you have to clarify whether there's exemptions that cover your firearms. Again, there's only 14 states that do that. The other way to possibly exempt firearms is if your state has what we call a wild card exemption. A wild card exemption basically says you can keep assets up to a certain value, like say $5,000. So you can usually put your firearms into the wild card if your state has that available. All right. But in Colorado, where I practice, there's no wild card exemption and there's no firearm exemption, and that's common in most states. So what do you do if you have firearms in bankruptcy? So first is be honest about it. Don't try to hide your firearms. Hiding assets is bankruptcy fraud. That's criminal. Just be upfront and tell your attorney, yeah, I got some firearms, and then I'm going to ask you for an inventory, right? I want to know, model, make, model, caliber, and approximately what year you got it or purchased it, and then what is its current value, right? So when you file Chapter 7 bankruptcy, right, so there's either going to be exemption or there's not, and the question becomes, well, how much is it worth, right? So the first thing you can do is, you can sell your firearms if you like before the bankruptcy. Now that doesn't allow you to keep them, but it does allow you to liquidate or sell the firearms, get the cash, and use it for your benefit, and therefore it doesn't go into the bankruptcy. So you can do that, but you have to sell them for a reasonable fair market value. You can't offload them to your brother for $10 and then have your brother just give them back to you after the bankruptcy. Whatever you do, don't do that. All right? The second option is you can file Chapter 13 bankruptcy, which is a monthly payment plan, and Chapter 13s are not about your assets. I have a video that talks about what Chapter 13 bankruptcy is and how it works, so you can check that out for more information. But Chapter 13 is a way to do it, but usually Chapter 13 is not worth it if the only unprotected asset is firearms. And the most common way we deal with firearms in bankruptcy is redemption. So let's say you have $2,400 worth of firearms, because if one thing's for certain is most people who own firearms don't own just one, they own multiple firearms. So let's say you have $2,400 value. You can negotiate and buy those out of the bankruptcy. Now, of course, that means you have to come up with $2,400 to buy them out of the bankruptcy estate or buy them back from the trustee. All right. Now, most trustees, most Chapter 7 trustees will allow you to do a 6-month payment plan, sometimes 9 months, depending on what it is. So you can sort of buy them out of the bankruptcy, what we call redemption, to keep the firearms. And then lastly, if you don't care about the firearms, and if you're offloading $50,000 of debt, losing $2,400 worth of firearms is still a pretty darn good deal. But the point is, firearms are a big hassle in bankruptcy because you want to keep them. They're usually worth something and they're not protected. So we have to come up with a strategy to allow you to keep those firearms. So make sure you hire a competent bankruptcy attorney that knows what they're doing, because I got story after story when I go to the trustee meeting and look at other people's interview with the bankruptcy trustee. It always seems to come as a shock to them that their firearms aren't protected. Their bankruptcy attorney didn't prepare them for the fact that their shotgun and their rifle are going to be taken in the bankruptcy, and you can see the surprise on their face. You're like, wait, what? You're going to take my firearms, or I got to pay you the value of the firearms? Don't let that come as a surprise. So I hope this video has been helpful. Again, my name is Matt Burkus. I'm a Colorado bankruptcy and debt relief attorney. Happy hunting.